I'm David Dow. I'm originally from Los Angeles, born and raised there, and spent about 25 years in Sonoma County, in the northern part of the state. And then 5 years ago, I ended up in Bloomington Normal. I started my work again 2 years ago in clay. That was my training. Went to school in Southern Illinois for 2 years at a small parochial college, and then went back to Los Angeles to USC's Fine Arts program, and ceramics was my major there. And I dragged around tools for a lot of years, not working in the studio, and then maybe 2 years ago I got back into it. And because I didn't have a kiln at home, I explored self-hardening clay, and that's where I started. And this show is an emergence of glass beadwork that is done in wax. So it's all handwork with beads and wax. I started my exploration back in the studio with clay, and then I started working with embedding things into clay, coins, artifacts. It was kind of exploring the idea of scarification and embellishment and what Western culture views as primitive, as opposed to plastic surgery and Botox and things. Somehow that's civilized, but self-decoration and self-painting and things like that are primitive. So the work was exploring that, but the medium was also telling me that when you embed something into clay and it dries and shrinks and the embedded objects don't, then there can be some real Frankenstein projects where there's cracking and work falls apart. So I was visiting actually an antique store in Southwest Michigan up in Lakeside, and I saw this beautiful mask that was a Bamoun mask. The people of Cameroon were bead masters. They worked for elders and ceremonies and embellished and beaded masks and objects. And this was just a spectacular piece. And it got me to thinking that, maybe I wanted to pursue this beading more seriously and more as a primary medium. And I started really testing different things. The different peoples of Mexico work with beads and beeswax, but that's really soft and it doesn't stand up to the sort of mass and figures that I wanted to do. And so I asked a friend, an artist, who works in ceramics, what she recommended, and she said, you just have to do a lot of Frankenstein projects and experimenting until you find something that really works. And that's what I did, and finally landed on a particular medium that I can work under a heat lamp so that the wax medium is soft and pliable, and hand embed the beads into that. And then when the heat is turned off, it solidifies and hardens, so it captures the bead and holds it where the clay was kind of rejecting it and things would pop off. So it's been a lot of experimentation, but 2020 provided a lot of time for experimentation and exploration of work. And in my, whether it was clay or paper mache, which I've worked in, or in the beading and wax, it's a kind of cerebral experience. You're really in your head with the medium. And so, particularly in 2020, where there was so much, at least for me, and I think a lot of other artists and people in general, so much self-reflection and contemplation about the situation we found ourselves in and people's responses and the politics of our nation and the division. And so, that studio time and that self-exploration really got my mind thinking about past experiences in my childhood and exposure to cultures that were vastly different than my own, and this appreciation and love for, not just tolerance, but appreciation and love for cultural diversity and the cultures of other people in our world. And that came up for me, memories about my grandparents who collected American Indian jewelry, pottery, baskets, rugs throughout the Southwest. And my grandmother was a formidable character who wore old pawn turquoise bracelets from wrist to elbow on both arms and these magnificent squash blossoms around her neck every day. This was not just an occasion. And my very gentle grandfather who doted on her and bought her all of these kind of treasures. So I grew up as a young child with this fascination and appreciation for, you know, the work of these American Indian artisans and the beautiful things they did. And so if you see that manifested in part of the show, there are kind of these recollections that the show are based upon. And Great Phyllis, my grandmother, and Ren, my grandfather, is one part of it. And then a childhood memory of a gentleman named Asiba Johnson, who was the most elegant and blackest man that I had ever met. He was an associate of my father's from Ghana, and he came to dinner one night at our home, and he brought with him this phallic fertility carving that he had brought from Ghana, you know, in his suitcase to this young man that he had never met, and talked about it and talked about his country and crafts and culture and things. And that memory of this man's kindness and gesture to a child with a piece of his country was a lasting impression about the kindness of people that can exist between cultures. And it's an object that I've carried around for more than 50 years, always having a place of prominence in my home, and just, again, this kind of connection to how I think we should, as culturals, live together, thrive together, appreciate each other's differences, and not just tolerate them. Interestingly, I used that word tolerate once a couple years ago in a discussion with a local activist, and she had this really extreme negative reaction saying, I don't want just to be tolerated. I don't want your tolerance. I want to be accepted and an equal at the table here. And it was a really good reminder of language. I think we have to be careful because sometimes intent is not necessarily ill-intentioned or nefarious, that we have to be empathetic enough to meet each other wherever we are on a path and think about the words we use and the intent, but also be aware of words that can trigger. And I think, I hope that part of what this show will do is that people will enjoy it superficially on a decorative level. That's okay. I am not an artist who thinks that decorative is a bad word, and if people want to enjoy it at that particular level, it's great. But if people also want to see these inspirations of different cultures, and hopefully my respect for, love for, appreciation for building this show around that, that would be good too. The last kind of anchor in the show is all about a recollection as a child. My father had offices in Iran, so as a young kid, 4th through 8th grades, I spent a good deal of time, 3 different occasions in Tehran. And as this young, fat, freckled kid wandering around the bazaars and the calls to prayer, just this vastly different culture than a Los Angeles kid. And one particular memory that came up for me so much as I was looking on my work table with all these piles of beads was a visit to the crown jewels of Iran. They were literally in this bank vault, and there was all this magnificent, spectacular objects, crowns, scepters, thrones, jewelry, all of that. But then there were these like bowls made of rubies and gold, full of rubies, just cut and uncut stones, but not finished into anything. There were bowls of rubies and bowls of emeralds, and the backs of display cases were hung with strands of pearls. It was just this incredible opulence, and I think part of the show will be the memories of this young child looking at bowls of red and green and not totally fathoming that they were precious stones of great value, but just seeing that kind of abundance. And so there's a part of that that is a nod to yet a different culture, a Muslim culture that has many beautiful things and some things that are troublesome from an outsider's point of view, but it is understanding what is true and beautiful and good and what has been distorted and happens in all cultures, and trying to understand the commonality of it. So there are references both to a different culture, but also just to this young child's recollection of all these beads. I'm a self-taught artist, and this is a self-taught medium and practice, so it's a lot of trial and error, but you really get to know, like with clay, it's kind of a personal experience with the clay, and I have developed that with the wax where I know when I can embed and it will just hold things versus swallowing it up. And then I work and bead, and it's interesting how sometimes patterns are conscious in terms of how I'm layering in the beads, and sometimes, and beautifully, they emerge. Like if I'm working around some eyes, or if I'm going in a particular direction and doing it on both sides of the face, you get these patterns starting to take shape that are symmetrical and interesting. So that kind of, in going back to how do you want the viewers of the show to see things, I hope people will take the time to see the whole of a piece, but then actually look at the intricacy of what happens by individual beads and then collectively those beads together, and how they really come together to make these incredible shapes. I think people are more surprised how much we like it here. My partner, Jim Neely, is from Normal. He was in Bay Area, San Francisco for about 40 years. We had been coming back and forth for a number of years to visit his father, and then as his father's health was declining, it became important for us to be here as active part of his care. So 5 years ago we moved back, and actually I love it. There's so much more of a sense of community. We were polite with our neighbors in Northern California, but we didn't really know anybody. We didn't socialize. And here we're close with neighbors in the community. We've gotten very involved with local nonprofits and organizations. The parking at the airport is free rather than $35 a day in San Francisco. So, there's a lot to be said for the community sense of it. So I'm very happy to be here. Institutional galleries, institutional arts organizations are so critical now because the pandemic has devastated galleries around the country. They are not just closing temporarily, but in many cases shuttering. The New York art scene, I have friends who are accomplished artists who have had their galleries permanently closed, and they're having to gather their archived work and figure out exposure and sales and all these things. So on a top tier level, I think it's the opportunity that McLean County Art Center provides artists and local artists as this kind of anchor in our community in central Illinois, in Illinois itself, to be this anchor space to be seen at. And you know, it also, I think, for me, provides a sense of credibility, that to be reviewed by a peer of artists and board members in an organization like this, and to have the work accepted, is a validation at some level, and an acknowledgement of the work, and that you would take the time to do this, your communications, your support, your encouragement, and to have a show that's a significant amount of time, I just all think is validating as well.